What's up, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 bucks. This is the show where we take your favorite commander, slap on a $50 budget, and make a deck that not only is functional, but also is able to win you the game. My name is Stefan. I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. Glad you can join us today. It's finally December, which means it's the holidays for those who celebrate it. They're upon us. Mariah Carey is playing in every single mall right now, and your sloppy drunk uncle is making his famous batch of nog. What it also means is that the year is coming to a close for everything Magic the Gathering related, including sets and everything. So starting this week and going until the very last week of the year, I'm going to be doing a Brewing with 50 bucks episode for each week of the year for every single set that came out this year, minus Modern Horizons 2. This week is the very first week, and let's start it off with the very first set that came out this year, Kaldheim. If you remember, my first two brews were of Toralf, which is my second most popular video on my channel, so thank you very much for that, truly appreciate it, and Agar the Freezing Flame. So we'll continue that with our very last Kaldheim commander that we're going to be doing on this channel for the foreseeable future, which is going to be Toralf, God of Fury. I decided on Toralf since his ability is easily accessible to mono red burn and can easily win when nobody is looking your way. So with that, let's look at our commander and let's get started with the video, shall we? Our commander of this week is Toralf God of Fury, a 5/4 for 2 red legendary god with trample, and whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, Toralf deals damage equal to the excess to any target other than that permanent. And it is a double-faced card which turns over into Toralf's Hammer, a legendary equipment for 1 and a red with equipped creature has 1 and a red, and tap it to unattach Toralf's Hammer. It deals 3 damage to any target. Return Toralf's Hammer to its owner's hand. Equipped creature gets +3/+0 as long as it's legendary with equip 1 and a red. So with this deck, we're primarily focusing on Toralf. The Hammer is not exactly unnecessary in this deck. It is good to have, however, the majority of this deck is going to be focused around Toralf, be it with giant spells that can burn your opponents and big stuff that will get in and kill your opponents with one giant fireball to the face. And as always, we brew these decks with a budget of around $50, which includes the price of the commander, which excludes the price of the basic lands, and we also have a $5 overage compromise, which means you could still build this deck within a $50 budget, but we also offer a $5 leniency for those of you who actually can afford the extra money. It's not super expensive. That's why we add that $5 overage compromise. You can find the deck list in the show notes down below, and if I can ask you of one small little thing, if you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell icon right now. One small click goes a long way for this channel. So we're going to be taking a look at 6 categories today. These are the standard breakdown for each of our decks. Our categories are creatures, artifacts, sorceries, instants, enchantments, and lands. And we're going to get started off today with actually art and artifacts. The majority of our deck is artifacts, not intentionally, but a lot of our artifacts get us to where we need to go, especially in terms of ramp and especially in terms of protecting Toralf and getting some extra damage in. The first artifact we're looking at is Armillary Sphere, a 2-mana artifact that allows you to sacrifice it and search your library for up to 2 basic lands, put them into your hand, and then shuffle your deck. Red doesn't have a lot of ramp in this deck, especially the way that green allows it, so Armillary Sphere is clutch in this case. If you need a reshuffle, this gives you that reshuffle ability. Basilisk Collar is next. For 1, equipped to a legendary creature has Death Touch and Lifelink. Imagine Toralf dealing excess damage and you're gaining the life back from it. That's the reason why Basilisk Collar is in this deck, especially even if you have to deal 1 damage to each one of your opponent's creatures. You could just poke each one of them, they die, and then you could deal the excess to that player instead. Commander Sphere is next, allowing you to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. An extra mana rock in this deck is never bad, especially one that allows you to sacrifice it and draw an extra card. Everflowing Chalice is next. The reason we're adding Everflowing Chalice in this deck, for the purposes of we want our big spells, especially our X spells, to deal a lot of damage, so we can just siphon all the red mana that we have into Everflowing Chalice for a giant chalice. Next is Fire Diamond. This is a red staple card, especially in our budget like ours. Considering we have a limited amount of ramp in our deck, having an extra rock doesn't hurt us, especially getting this out on turn 2. You have 3 mana, potentially 4 mana through turn 3. Genesis Chamber is next. The reason we're adding this card in the deck is mainly to give our opponents creatures so that way Toralf can deal damage and deal excess damage to creatures as well. Hazardous Monument allows us to cheat out our red creatures, especially Toralf, and whenever we cast a creature, we get to rummage through our deck, discard a card, and draw a card. Hedron Archive allows us to get some extra colorless mana on the field and to get us some extra card draw as well. Horizon Stone is another very fun card that we add in this deck. The reason why we're adding this, again, like Everflowing Chalice, we are going to be making a lot of mana in this deck, and especially we don't want to lose it, so we could just tap it, and we could tap as much mana as we need, siphon it, and just make it turn into colorless mana so we have it at our next turn as well. Luxodon Warhammer is up next. This is giving Toralf Trample and Lifelink. Even though he already has Trample, the Lifelink is always good, and a +3 boost, never bad, especially for 3 mana and a 3 mana equip. Magebane Armor is next, and this is probably the most clutch card that we have in our deck, mainly giving our god, preventing all non-combat damage that would be dealt to it, especially if we have board state effects that can wipe our creatures, especially stuff that we'll be seeing in this deck. Protecting Toralf is key, and having Magebane Armor is extremely clutch. Mindstone's up next, allowing us to get another extra colorless and to sacrifice it to draw an extra card. Next we're looking at is Pyromancer's Gauntlet. Now this might seem like a very innocuous card in this deck, however, this is a damage amplifier in this deck, so it's never bad, especially in the case of Toralf. We're dealing extra excess damage, and each one of those damage is +2 to the permanent or player. So yeah, if we're casting a spell that will target something for 3, it'll deal 5 damage instead. Pyromancer's Goggles is next, where allowing us to add a red mana, and if it's spent to cast an instant or sorcery, we get to copy it and choose new targets if we want. Soul Ring is next. Of course, we're going to add Soul Ring in this deck, especially one that we want to get a lot of mana and ramp out very fast, especially so since we don't have a good amount of clean ramp. We need a lot of artifact ramp, and Soul Ring, especially dropping it on a turn 1, is always so glorious. Swiftfoot Boots is next. This is our way to protect Toralf. Giving him haste and hexproof is amazing. Haste to get in for the damage, and hexproof to protect him from any potential kill spells from our opponents. And lastly, Unstable Obelisk allows us to add either a colorless or for 7 and sack it to destroy a target permanent. Red doesn't have any answers, mainly for our enchantments, and it doesn't deal too well for other board state stuff that doesn't say destroy target artifacts. So Unstable Obelisk is very good in our deck if we have a problematic card that we need to get rid of. Next we're going to be taking a look at is our creatures. We're running 15 creatures in this deck, and we're going to start off very promptly with Bone Crusher Giant. This is one of those adventure cards that can be played for 2 ways. The first is Stomp for 2 mana. Damage can't be prevented this turn. It deals 2 damage to any target, and whenever Bone Crusher Giant becomes the target of a spell, it deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. It protects itself, and for 3 mana, you have a 4/3 on the field. This is pretty good as well, since you get to cast it for its instant cost, it goes away, and then you get to recast it for its creature cost. I really like it. Brash Taunter is next. This is one of our spicy tech cards, especially it's indestructible, and for the sole fact that it gets to fight other creatures, and it's like a stuffy doll effect. Burnish Heart is next. As I mentioned before, this is just going to help us with ramp, and as you know, we need a lot of ramp when it comes to red, since, like I said before, we don't have a lot of clean ramp like green does, so Burnish Heart is going to get us there a little bit faster. Electrostatic Field is next. With this, you get to deal damage for every instant sorcery spell you cast. Gutter Snipe is next. The same thing goes, but you get to deal 2 damage instead. Inferno Titan is up next. It is amazing red staple, and it's been one of my favorite red cards for the last 10 to 15 years, because when it enters the battlefield, you get to deal 3 damage, divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets, and even when it attacks, you also get that trigger as well. Radiant Performer is next, and this is a new card from this year, actually. So this copies instants and sorceries from your opponents. If they're trying to get rid of Toralf, you can play Radiant Performer, and it can target every other creature as well. So if you're gonna have somebody kill Toralf, Radiant Performer kills every creature on the board. If somebody's gonna deal damage or deal something to you, you could play Radiant Performer and deal it to each other opponent too. This is such a tech card and it's so cheap. Ryusei, the Falling Star, is next. When it dies, it deals 5 damage to each creature without flying. So if you have a sack outlet or if you have a way to kill Ryusei, the extra damage will go to each creature. And with Toralf, you can actually do the excess to wherever you want to go. Satyr Fire Dancer is next. So whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control deals damage to an opponent, it deals damage to target creature that player controls. You could easily do this and have Toralf stack it, the ability, so that way whenever dealing damage to an opponent is dealing excess damage to each of their creatures. Sin Prodder is next. This is actually another really funny tech card. With this, you can actually have your opponents lose life just from you trying to draw a card. Yeah, if you try to draw a card, they can refuse it and they take damage for it. And you can definitely amplify it too with Pyromancer's Goggles and other cards we'll be seeing in this deck. Next we're looking at is Solemn Simulacrum, aka Sad Robot. This is extra ramp and extra card draw in our deck, and I love the Sad Robot. Next is Stuffy Doll. I decided to shove this card in the deck, and because basically having an extra effect that can deal damage to your opponents whenever it's dealing excess damage is just insanely good. I love it. Tectonic Giant is next. Whenever it attacks or becomes the target of a spell or ability, you could have it deal 3 damage to each opponent, or you can exile the top 2 cards of your library, and you get to play one of those until your next turn. This is actually some good tech too. So anytime you target something with a spell or ability, well, even if you're equipping the Tectonic Giant, you can actually deal damage to your opponents. Torbrand Thane of Redfell is next. This is one of our damage amplifiers. Everybody knows what Torbrand does. Whenever you deal damage, whenever a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent, it deals damage +2. So it's going to amplify your damage either from Toralf's attack or from one of your instants and sorceries that you're going to be casting. And lastly, Young Pyromancer. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you create 1/1 red elemental creature token. With this, for each one of our instants and sorceries we're casting, we're getting some extra creatures on the field, some extra bodies, and some extra protectors. Next, we're going to be looking at is our sorcery cards. We're running 13 sorceries. This is actually one of the few decks that I'm running more sorceries in the deck than instants, but you'll see why in just a bit. First, we're going to look at is Burn Down the House. This is actually a card I found from Close Quarters, so thank you, Mitch. Basically, you get to deal 5 damage to each creature or each planeswalker, or you get to create 3 1/1 red devils. Most of the time, you're going to be using the deal 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, because 5 damage actually goes a long way and can completely board wipe your opponent's fields. And with Toralf, each one of those creatures that deal excess, you could just put it right at your opponent's face. Byforce allows you to destroy target artifacts. However many that you put as the X. Cathartic Reunion allows you to rummage your cards, discard 2 of them, draw 3. Chain Reaction allows you to deal X damage, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. Again, with Toralf, depending on how big the amount of damage is, you could deal that excess to your opponent's face. Fiery Encore, one of the only storm cards that we have in this deck, allowing you to discard a card and then draw a card, and if you discard a non-land card, you get to deal damage equal to that card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker. With Toralf, the excess damage can go right to somebody's face, and you get to storm off with this for however many cards you cast before Fiery Encore. Hour of Devastation is next, another card that allows you to deal 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, but in this case, it's non-bolas planeswalkers, and all creatures lose indestructible until end of turn. Make sure you don't have your Brash Taunter or your Stuffy Doll on the field when you're playing Hour of Devastation. It's also a really good card to board wipe your opponent's fields with. Into the Maw of Hell is next. It is probably one of the most mana value consuming cards. For 6 mana, you get to destroy target land, and it deals 13 damage to target creature. 13 damage is a lot of damage to one creature, so Toralf is easily going to trigger off this and deal the excess to wherever it needs to go. Jaya's Invalidating Inferno is next. This is a legendary sorcery, so you have to have a legendary creature or planeswalker on the field for this to actually be playable. But it gets to deal X damage to each up to 3 targets as you choose, so you could deal the X to whichever targets you want, and then Toralf will just do his thing afterwards. Meteor Swarm is next, dealing 8 damage divided as long as you choose among X target creatures or planeswalkers, so you can basically just play this for 4. Toralf will trigger, and then each one of the extra damage will just go to each of the creatures or their opponent's face. Mizzium Mortars is next. 4 damage to target creature you control, but you get to overload it for 6 mana, and with that, Toralf can trigger and just completely destroy somebody. Slag Storm is next, dealing 3 damage to each creature or each player, and with that, Toralf will do his thing, allowing you to get rid of your opponent's smaller creatures, but this is also a really good card just to keep your opponents off their board states. Tormenting Voice is another rummage card. You get to pitch a card and draw 2 in instead. And lastly, Volcanic Vision, equal to that mana value to each creature your opponent controls. And you have to exile at the end of turn. We are going to take a look at our instants next. We are running 12 instants. Like I said, not that far in between the sorceries. However, we're running a little bit less instants in this deck. First off, we're going to talk about is Arc Bond. With this, you get to choose target creature, and when it dealt damage this turn, it deals that much damage to each other creature and each player. Especially against Voltron decks, if you have an opponent dealing a big, massive amount of damage, you get to play Arc Bond and deal that damage to each other creature and each player. So Toralf can actually easily trigger off this and completely just destroy somebody. Blitz of the Thunder Raptor is next. This is a 1 creature kill with this, and you get to exile it. If it dies, it's based on the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. We're running roughly 25 instants and sorceries in this deck, so this can actually ramp up very, very quickly. Considering with Toralf, you can just mitigate all the damage to each creature. You could be exiling their entire board with that. Fire Prophecy is next. It deals 3 damage to target creature, and it actually gets to rummage you if you like. Instead of just having to discard it, you could put it on the bottom of your library and you draw a card from it. So it's some pretty small tech, but it's really, really good. Impact Resonance is next, and with this, you get to deal X damage, where X is the greatest amount of damage dealt to a sorcerer, permanent, or player this turn. So you could basically just have a big spell play like Into the Maw of Hell, as I mentioned before. And you get to Impact Resonance and deal an extra 13 damage to something or somebody. Increasing Vengeance allows you to copy an instant or sorcery spell and choose new targets with a flashback cost of 5 mana. Magma Quake allows you to deal X damage to each creature without flying and each planeswalker, so this way Toralf can trigger and deal the excess as needed to each creature and planeswalker. Overblaze is next, and this is one of the few cards I didn't know about until researching this deck. So each time Toralf deals the excess damage, it'll deal double that damage instead. So if you do this correctly, you can have Toralf dealing double damage to each of your opponent's creatures, and even dealing double damage to your opponent's faces. Repeated Reverberation is next, and whenever you cast instant, spell, sorcery, or activate a loyalty ability, you get to copy it twice. So you get to double copy off it. Starstorm is next, dealing X damage to each creature with a cycling 3. You know how much I love cycling in these videos and in these cards, so that's why I added in it. It's just an extra damage board wipe, X damage board wipe I should say, but the extra cycling ability allows it to be that much better. Thrill of Possibility is next. It's another rummage card that we're adding in this deck, pitching a card and drawing 2. Volcanic Fallout for 3 mana allows you to deal 2 damage to each creature and each player. And lastly, Volcanic Offering, destroy target non-basic land you don't control and deal 7 damage to target creature you don't control. You can choose your opponent and they do the exact same thing. Our second to last category is our enchantments. We're running 7 enchantments. This is the smallest category. Some of these enchantments are very, very good and very, very surprising. So let's get started with Dictate of the Twin Gods. I wanted to fit this in because it is a damage doubler and is a damage amplifier. Flash speed, if your sorcery would deal damage to a player, it deals double that damage instead. Double vision allows you to copy the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn. Gratuitous Violence allows you to deal double damage whenever a creature you control would deal damage to a permanent or player. Outpost Siege is amazing, especially if you're using this for cons. You're mainly using this for cons. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get to exile the top card of your library, and then you could play it that turn. Sulfuric Vortex is just very memey in this deck. The reason I'm adding this is just for the incremental 2 damage to each player. Basically, each player can't gain extra life. So that way you are guaranteed to deal a lot of damage to your opponents. Tectonic Reformation allows you to rummage your lands if you have a surplus of them and get to cycle them out of your hand. And Vance's Blasting Cannons allows you to exile the top card of your library, and if it's a non-land, you get to cast it that turn. And if you cast 3 of them, it flips over to Spitfire Bastion. Basically, it's a land that allows you to deal 3 damage to target creature or player. However, I much prefer the Vance's Blasting Cannons in this regard. Last category we're talking about is our land base. We are running 35 lands. This is the fuel to our engine. Let's go with Arch of Oraska, allowing you to draw cards for 5 mana as long as you have the City's Blessing. In this case, it's very hard to get the City's Blessing considering you're going to be board wiping a lot of the time. However, once you do, you have an extra outlet to draw some extra cards. Bonder's Enclave is next, and basically you can easily trigger this with Toralf when he comes on the field, because the limitation to this is that you get to draw a card only if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Myriad Landscape is the only fetch we're going to be using in this deck because you know how much I love it. Basically, comes into play tap, adds a colorless, and for 2 and tap it, sacrifice it, and you get to search your library for up to 2 basic lands and put them into the battlefield tapped. Spinerock Knoll is great, especially in a deck that deals a lot of damage because it's a hideaway land and you get to play the card as long as the opponent has been dealt 7 or more damage this turn. Especially in a deck like this, it's easily going to be played. The hideaway card is going to be easily played, I should say. Now, Tyrite Sanctum, it was a contentious card I decided to add in this deck because it allows you to give Toralf Indestructible. So it's going to be one of the easiest things to put in this deck. Now you have to be mindful of cards like Swords of Plowshares or Descend Upon the Sinful for exile abilities or sacrifice stuff like Turgid decks. Ugh. But nonetheless, you get to make your god indestructible and it taps for a colorless mana. We're also running 30 mountains in the deck. And that's how you build the copyrighted God of Thunder, raining lightning down upon your opponents. And with our budget of $50, which includes the price of Toralf, which excludes the basic lands, our deck comes to a total of $52.06, which makes this in our budget. So, like I mentioned to you, we have our $5 overage compromise, and with this $2, anybody can add an extra $2 to it. So it is going a little bit over $50. However, we have that compromise in place, and for that, you could build this deck for roughly around $50. Now, let's take a look at our pros and cons and some out-of-budget recommendations for this deck. All right, so let's get into the pros and cons. So some of the pros in this is that it is extremely aggressive, and you can consider this as a con as well. However, in playtesting, this deck actually gets a pop off very, very quickly. Like, I've been able to consistently do turn 3 Toralfs and even as early as turn 2 Toralfs in my tests, and especially so with the amount of damage you're dealing with this deck, it is incredible how aggressive it can actually be. You get to burn your opponents constantly, so with the amount of burn spells we added in this deck, it's a no-brainer that your opponents are going to get burned for a lot of life, and as long as they're not gaining the amount of life back, you're going to be in such a good driver's seat. It's pretty consistent when it comes to ramp as well. The amount of ramp that we have in this deck, including Soul Ring, And I'm going to leave it off here with you guys today. Thank you very much for watching. If you made it this far in the video, and if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider liking the video, sharing amongst your play group, subscribing to the channel, and click that bell icon. One small click from you goes a long way for me getting to reach more people who like this, who enjoy this kind of content, like yourselves. You can also follow me on my socials. They're going to be linked in the bottom left-hand side of your screen right now. You're going to see my TikTok, my Facebook, my Instagram, and my Twitter. I am very, very active on all of those. And you'll be able to recommend video ideas and deck ideas to brew on this channel. And I post every Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Lastly, before I leave you off today, this is the first of 5 videos that will come out until the end of the year. We can now scratch off Kaldheim from this list and focus on our next set, which is Strixhaven. Tune in next week for that video, and until then, cheers everybody.